The limits of monetary power, why reserve currency privilege ultimately depends on trust. Summary statement. Reserve currency privilege is not sustained by economic size or geopolitical power alone. It ultimately depends on trust. Trust is the confidence that reserve assets will remain liquid, accessible, legally protected, and politically usable across a wide range of future conditions. Geopolitical power can initially reinforce that trust by providing security and stability. Beyond a certain threshold, however, the increasing use of coercion transforms monetary privilege into counterparty risk, encouraging reserve diversification rather than concentration. This exposition develops the concept of a trust threshold, examines its historical foundations, and considers whether the contemporary international monetary system may be approaching such an inflection point. Section 1. The historical bargain. Throughout history, remarkably few currencies have achieved reserve status. The Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling, and the United States dollar each dominated their respective eras, not simply because their issuing nations were wealthy or militarily powerful, but because the rest of the world voluntarily chose to concentrate capital within their monetary systems. That distinction is important. Reserve currency status is not imposed. It is earned. Every reserve currency system rests upon an implicit bargain between the issuing nation and the rest of the world. The issuer receives extraordinary privileges. It enjoys lower borrowing costs, deeper capital markets, greater monetary flexibility, and the ability to finance deficits more easily than other nations. International trade increasingly clears through its currency. Its government securities become benchmark collateral for global finance. Demand for its sovereign debt becomes structurally larger than domestic savings alone could support. In return, the rest of the world expects something equally valuable: trust. Not political friendship, not ideological alignment. Trust. That trust is reflected in a belief that reserve assets will remain dependable regardless of changing political circumstances. This historical bargain has often been misunderstood. Reserve currency privilege is frequently described as a consequence of economic size or military dominance. While both contribute, neither is sufficient on its own. History suggests that military power may establish the conditions for reserve status, but it cannot sustain it indefinitely. Trust performs that role. The reserve currency becomes the world's preferred store of sovereign liquidity because governments believe they will continue to have reliable access to their reserves under a wide range of future conditions. The privilege therefore extends far beyond economics. It becomes institutional. Section 2. Defining trust. The word trust is used constantly throughout economics, finance, and geopolitics, yet it is rarely defined with sufficient precision. From the perspective of reserve management, trust carries a very specific meaning. In reserve management, trust means confidence that an asset will remain liquid, accessible, legally protected, and politically usable across a wide range of future conditions. This definition shifts the discussion away from sentiment and toward observable institutional properties. Reserve managers are not primarily concerned with whether they admire the issuing nation, nor are they principally concerned with maximizing nominal investment returns. Their responsibility is considerably more conservative. They must preserve national wealth across decades, while ensuring that reserve assets remain available during periods of economic crisis, financial stress, or geopolitical confrontation. Viewed through this lens, trust becomes operational rather than emotional. It can be evaluated, it can be compared, it can even deteriorate. This perspective also explains why reserve management differs fundamentally from conventional investing. Private investors often optimize for return on capital. Reserve managers first optimize for the return of capital. The distinction is subtle but profound. When trust is abundant, reserve managers naturally compare yields between safe assets. When trust begins to weaken, the question itself changes. Instead of asking, what yield can we earn safely, they increasingly ask, will our reserves remain liquid, accessible, legally protected, and politically usable when we need them most? That change in perspective marks the beginning of an entirely different decision-making process. Yield becomes secondary. Resilience becomes paramount. Section 3. The Reserve Asset Trust Test. If trust can be defined operationally, then it can also be evaluated systematically. This leads naturally to a simple analytical framework: Every reserve asset can be assessed by asking four questions. First, is it liquid? Can it be bought or sold in sufficient size without materially disrupting the market? Liquidity allows reserve managers to mobilize capital rapidly during periods of financial stress. An asset that cannot be converted efficiently into purchasing power cannot reliably perform a reserve function. Second, is it accessible? Can the holder reliably obtain, settle, transfer, and utilize the asset under both normal and stress conditions? Accessibility extends beyond market liquidity. It concerns whether the owner can actually exercise control over the asset when circumstances become difficult. Third, is it legally protected? Can ownership reasonably be expected to remain protected by established legal institutions and property rights? Reserve assets exist within legal systems. Confidence depends upon the expectation that ownership rights will remain predictable and enforceable even during periods of political disagreement. Fourth, is it politically usable? Can the asset continue functioning during periods of geopolitical conflict, sanctions, or diplomatic tension? This final characteristic distinguishes reserve management from conventional portfolio management. Assets may retain their market value while simultaneously becoming politically constrained. From the perspective of a sovereign reserve manager, those are not equivalent outcomes. An asset that cannot be freely deployed when national interests require it may no longer satisfy the fundamental purpose of a reserve asset. Taken together, these four questions form what may be called the reserve asset trust test. Rather than treating trust as an abstract concept, the framework converts it into a practical diagnostic tool that can be applied consistently across reserve assets, historical periods, and monetary systems. Most importantly, the framework allows trust to be examined independently of ideology. It does not ask whether an issuing nation is admired. It asks whether its reserve assets continue to satisfy the institutional requirements upon which reserve status ultimately depends. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4, the trust threshold. If trust can be defined, and if reserve assets can be evaluated systematically, then an obvious question follows. Can trust change over time? History suggests that it can. Indeed, reserve currency systems appear to evolve through a remarkably consistent sequence. Initially, geopolitical power reinforces trust. Strong institutions, secure trade routes, military protection, reliable legal systems, and deep financial markets reduce uncertainty. The issuing nation provides what economists often describe as global public goods: security, financial infrastructure, monetary stability. As perceived risk falls, international capital naturally concentrates within that system. At this stage, power and trust reinforce one another. Greater security encourages greater capital concentration. Greater capital concentration lowers financing costs. Lower financing costs allow further investment in security and institutions. The system becomes self-reinforcing. However, this same success creates a subtle transformation. As more capital becomes concentrated within the reserve system, the issuing nation acquires increasing geopolitical leverage. Financial infrastructure becomes strategic infrastructure. Reserve assets become instruments of statecraft. Settlement systems become geopolitical tools. The reserve currency evolves beyond a medium of exchange into an instrument of international influence. Initially, this evolution strengthens the system. The credibility of enforcement reinforces confidence in the institutions that underpin it. But history suggests that this relationship is not unlimited. There appears to exist an inflection point, a trust threshold. Beyond this point, additional coercive power no longer reduces perceived risk. Instead, it begins to increase it. The reserve asset gradually changes character. Rather than being viewed as politically neutral infrastructure, it begins to be perceived as an asset whose future usability depends upon continued political alignment with the issuing state. This distinction is subtle, but profound. The concern is no longer credit risk. It is counterparty risk. A government may remain fully capable of honoring its financial obligations while simultaneously creating uncertainty about whether reserve assets will remain accessible, transferable, or politically usable under future geopolitical conditions. From the perspective of sovereign reserve managers, these are entirely different forms of risk. The result is a change in behavior. Capital no longer asks only, how much can we earn? Increasingly, it asks, can we rely upon this asset under circumstances we cannot yet predict? That change marks the crossing of the trust threshold. The system has not failed. The reserve currency has not necessarily lost its dominant role. Rather, the incentives governing reserve allocation begin to change. Diversification becomes rational, not because a superior reserve currency has necessarily emerged, but because excessive concentration itself has become a strategic vulnerability. The consequence is important. Reserve transitions rarely begin with abandonment. They begin with optionality. Governments do not immediately replace the dominant reserve currency. Instead, they gradually reduce dependence upon it. Additional reserve assets are accumulated. Alternative payment mechanisms are explored. Settlement options become more geographically distributed. Strategic redundancy begins to replace strategic concentration. The objective is not to eliminate the existing system. It is to reduce the consequences should that system become unavailable or politically constrained. In this sense, reserve diversification functions much like an immune response. The objective of an immune system is not to eliminate all external threats. It is to increase resilience by reducing dependence upon any single point of failure. Applied to international reserve management, the same logic emerges. Governments need not reject an existing reserve currency. They simply become less willing to rely upon it exclusively. The trust threshold therefore represents a behavioral transition. It marks the point at which geopolitical power, having initially strengthened confidence, begins instead to encourage strategic diversification. The reserve system continues to function, but the assumptions that previously sustained unconditional concentration begin to weaken. Section 5. Historical foundations. If the trust threshold represents a genuine structural phenomenon, then evidence of it should be observable historically. History cannot prove a theory. It can, however, reveal recurring patterns. Two reserve currency systems are particularly instructive: the Dutch guilder and British pound sterling. Neither lost reserve status suddenly. Neither collapsed because another currency appeared overnight with superior characteristics. Instead, both experienced a gradual deterioration in the institutional conditions that had originally sustained international trust. The process was evolutionary rather than revolutionary. The Dutch guilder. During the 17th century, the Dutch Republic became the world's commercial and financial center. The Bank of Amsterdam established a reputation for exceptional monetary discipline, reliable settlement, and institutional credibility. Its deposits became widely trusted because they were expected to remain fully backed, readily transferable, and politically dependable. In modern terminology, reserve managers believed the system satisfied all four dimensions of trust. The guilder was liquid. It was accessible. Its legal protections were widely respected. Its political neutrality reinforced confidence in international commerce. Over time, however, these foundations began to change. The Dutch Republic faced increasing military competition and rising fiscal pressures. The Bank of Amsterdam gradually departed from the strict reserve principles that had originally established its credibility, extending undisclosed credit to institutions closely connected with the Dutch state and the Dutch East India Company. The immediate consequences were limited. The institution continued operating. The currency continued circulating. International trade continued. Yet confidence had changed. The reserve asset was no longer perceived as operating independently of state priorities. The institutional neutrality that had originally underpinned trust had begun to weaken. The guilder did not collapse overnight. Rather, trust deteriorated first. Reserve prominence declined later. This distinction is central to the present framework. History suggests that trust weakens before reserve status does. The trust threshold is therefore not the moment of collapse. It is the moment at which the underlying direction of confidence begins to reverse. British sterling. A remarkably similar pattern emerged with British sterling. For more than a century, sterling occupied the center of the global financial system. Britain's industrial leadership, naval dominance, commercial reach, and legal institutions created extraordinary international confidence. London became the world's financial marketplace. British government securities became among the safest assets available. Again, geopolitical power initially reinforced monetary trust. Yet the very success of the system gradually increased Britain's strategic commitments. Imperial responsibilities expanded, military obligations multiplied. Public debt rose significantly through successive conflicts, culminating in the enormous fiscal burdens imposed by two world wars. Sterling remained globally important throughout much of this period, but its institutional foundations had begun to shift. Fiscal capacity became increasingly constrained, external liabilities expanded, convertibility became more difficult to maintain. The Suez Crisis of 1956 did not create sterling's problems, but it exposed them. It revealed that Britain's geopolitical influence and monetary independence were no longer as closely aligned as international markets had previously assumed. Confidence did not disappear overnight. Instead, reserve managers gradually adjusted their expectations. The United States dollar increasingly offered deeper markets, greater economic scale, and stronger institutional backing. Reserve diversification accelerated accordingly. Once again, the historical sequence was consistent. Trust weakened, diversification followed. Reserve transition occurred gradually thereafter. The pattern is striking. In neither historical case did reserve status disappear because economic output alone shifted. Rather, institutional confidence eroded as fiscal strain, geopolitical commitments, and changing perceptions of neutrality gradually altered the relationship between power and trust. History, therefore, suggests a broader principle. Reserve currencies rarely lose their position through sudden displacement. They first lose the unquestioned confidence that originally made global concentration appear rational. Only then does diversification begin. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 6. The United States as the Contemporary Case Study. The historical framework developed thus far naturally leads to a contemporary question. Does the present international monetary system exhibit characteristics consistent with a trust threshold? The objective here is not to declare that such a threshold has definitively been crossed. Rather, it is to examine whether observable developments are consistent with the historical patterns identified in previous reserve currency transitions. This distinction is essential. The proposition is analytical rather than ideological. The United States remains the issuer of the world's dominant reserve currency. The United States Treasury market remains the largest and deepest sovereign bond market in existence. The United States dollar continues to dominate global trade settlement, foreign exchange transactions, and international financial markets. None of these observations are disputed. The question is subtler. Has the nature of reserve trust begun to change? Historically, periods of geopolitical uncertainty strengthened demand for United States Treasury securities. During financial crises, military conflicts, or global instability, capital traditionally flowed toward dollar-denominated assets. This behavior reflected confidence that the United States represented the safest destination during periods of uncertainty. Implicitly, this assumes that the United States functions primarily as a stabilizing force within the international system. The contemporary environment raises the possibility that this relationship may be evolving. The United States increasingly employs financial sanctions, export controls, tariffs, restrictions on technology transfer, sovereign asset freezes, and the dollar-based financial system as instruments of foreign policy. Each individual measure may be justified or criticized on its own merits. The present framework is not concerned with those individual policy debates. Instead, it asks a different question. How do sovereign reserve managers interpret the cumulative effect of these developments? From the perspective of reserve management, the relevant issue is not whether sanctions are morally justified. It is whether reserve assets remain politically usable under adverse future conditions. This distinction returns us directly to the operational definition of trust. If reserve managers increasingly believe that future access to reserve assets may become contingent upon political alignment with the issuing state, then trust has changed, even if the underlying asset remains financially sound. The concern is not insolvency. The concern is conditionality. This leads to the central contemporary proposition developed throughout this exposition. The United States appears to operate within a strategic framework that assumes periods of geopolitical instability reinforce demand for United States government debt. Historically, this assumption has largely been correct. Periods of crisis generally increase demand for Treasury securities. However, history also suggests that reserve systems possess limits. Beyond a certain threshold, the source of instability itself becomes relevant. If the issuer of the reserve currency increasingly comes to be perceived as contributing to systemic uncertainty rather than simply mitigating it, reserve managers may begin reassessing the concentration of sovereign assets held within that system. Importantly, this does not require rejecting the dollar, nor does it require predicting an imminent replacement reserve currency. It requires only a change in behavior at the margin. Instead of asking, how much additional exposure should we accumulate, reserve managers may increasingly ask, how much concentration risk are we willing to tolerate? That subtle change in behavior is entirely consistent with the historical pattern established in previous reserve transitions. Section 7. Observable symptoms. If the trust threshold hypothesis has explanatory value, then its implications should be observable, not through dramatic events, through gradual changes in behavior. History suggests that reserve transitions begin long before reserve status itself changes. The relevant evidence therefore consists not of singular events, but of persistent directional trends. Reserve behavior. Perhaps the clearest observable trend has been the sustained accumulation of gold by central banks. Gold does not generate income. It does not finance governments. It provides no coupon and no dividend. Its value as a reserve asset lies elsewhere. Gold remains outside the liabilities of any sovereign issuer. It carries no direct counterparty risk. Its political usability depends primarily upon physical possession rather than continued access to another nation's financial infrastructure. Viewed through the reserve asset trust test, these characteristics become immediately apparent. Gold remains highly liquid. It is accessible to its owner. Ownership is well established legally. Most importantly, its usability does not generally depend upon maintaining political alignment with another sovereign government. The significance of central bank gold accumulation therefore extends beyond simple portfolio diversification. It may also represent diversification of institutional trust. Similarly, increasing interest in bilateral settlement arrangements, regional payment systems, and alternative financial infrastructure can be interpreted through the same framework. None of these developments require abandoning the dollar, nor do they imply that existing systems have failed. Rather, they increase optionality. History suggests that reserve transitions begin not with replacement, but with redundancy. Strategic resilience increasingly favors multiple pathways rather than singular dependence. Treasury market dynamics. The same framework can also be applied to sovereign debt markets. Historically, strong international demand for long-duration United States Treasury securities enabled the United States to finance substantial fiscal deficits at relatively favorable borrowing costs. If reserve managers gradually become less willing to increase long-term exposure, financing conditions may begin changing at the margin. This does not imply disappearing demand. It implies changing preferences. Maturity preferences become increasingly important. Who purchases government debt? At what duration? Under what conditions? These questions become increasingly significant indicators of institutional confidence. Viewed from this perspective, Treasury market dynamics become symptoms rather than independent explanations. They do not prove that trust has deteriorated. They may, however, become consistent with a broader process of reserve diversification. Domestic economic indicators. The same caution applies when interpreting domestic economic developments. Large fiscal deficits, rising interest costs, elevated public debt, and financing requirements are observable economic realities. Whether these developments represent temporary cyclical pressures or longer-term structural constraints remains open to debate. Likewise, reduced housing transaction volumes associated with higher borrowing costs may signal stress within interest rate-sensitive sectors of the economy. The important point is not that these developments independently establish the trust threshold. They do not. Rather, they become increasingly relevant when viewed alongside changing reserve behavior. Similarly, substantial investment in artificial intelligence infrastructure represents one of the largest capital allocation programs in modern economic history. Whether these investments ultimately generate returns commensurate with their scale remains uncertain. That uncertainty itself is not evidence of monetary decline. It is, however, another factor influencing long-term capital allocation and financing requirements. Taken individually, none of these observations proves the central thesis. Taken collectively, they describe an environment in which reserve managers may rationally place greater emphasis upon resilience, diversification, and strategic optionality. The framework therefore encourages interpretation through patterns rather than isolated events. History rarely announces structural transitions. Instead, it reveals them gradually through persistent changes in behavior. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 8. Implications. If the trust threshold framework is broadly correct, then it changes the questions policymakers, economists, and reserve managers should be asking. The central question is no longer, will the dollar lose its reserve currency status? Reserve currencies rarely disappear suddenly. History provides little support for abrupt monetary succession. Instead, the more relevant question becomes, will sovereign reserve managers continue increasing their dependence upon the existing reserve system? Those are fundamentally different questions. A reserve currency may remain dominant for decades, while simultaneously becoming progressively less concentrated within sovereign balance sheets. Usage and trust are not synonymous. A nation may continue settling international trade in dollars because the dollar remains the world's most liquid medium of exchange. That does not necessarily imply an equal willingness to accumulate ever larger quantities of long-duration dollar-denominated sovereign debt as a store of national wealth. This distinction between medium of exchange and store of value becomes increasingly important. Network effects make the dollar extraordinarily difficult to replace as a transactional currency. Settlement infrastructure, financial markets, global invoicing conventions, and decades of accumulated liquidity create powerful inertia. These characteristics are unlikely to disappear quickly. Store of value decisions, however, follow different incentives. Reserve managers are not obligated to maximize transaction efficiency. They are obligated to preserve sovereign optionality. As perceptions of geopolitical uncertainty evolve, reserve composition may evolve accordingly. Diversification, therefore, need not imply replacement. Gold does not need to replace the dollar. Alternative payment systems do not need to replace SWIFT. Regional settlement arrangements do not need to dominate global commerce. Each simply provides an additional layer of resilience. The result is a gradual shift away from exclusive dependence toward strategic redundancy. From this perspective, reserve management increasingly resembles risk management. The objective is no longer to maximize expected returns. It is to minimize irreversible vulnerability. This behavioral transition also reframes how sovereign wealth should be interpreted. Historically, reserve managers often optimize portfolios by comparing relative yields among assets already considered safe. Once the trust threshold begins to emerge, the optimization problem changes. The emphasis shifts from return on capital toward the return of capital. Questions that once centered upon income become questions of survivability. The decision process itself changes. Instead of asking, what yield can we earn safely? Reserve managers increasingly ask, will our reserves remain liquid, accessible, legally protected, and politically usable under future conditions that we cannot yet foresee? This is not merely a different investment strategy. It is a different philosophy of reserve management. The implications extend well beyond the United States. Every reserve currency system, regardless of issuer, ultimately depends upon maintaining confidence in these institutional properties. Power alone cannot indefinitely substitute for trust. Indeed, history suggests that power may ultimately contain its own limiting mechanism. The greater the concentration of global reserves within a single monetary system, the greater the temptation to employ that system as an instrument of geopolitical influence. Initially, such influence may reinforce stability. Beyond a certain threshold, however, The same influence begins encouraging reserve holders to seek strategic alternatives. The mechanism becomes self-limiting. Monetary privilege encourages greater geopolitical leverage. Greater geopolitical leverage encourages greater use of coercive tools. Greater coercion increases perceived counterparty risk. Perceived counterparty risk encourages diversification. Diversification gradually weakens the very concentration that originally created monetary privilege. The historical sequence is not one of abrupt collapse, it is one of gradual rebalancing. Section 9. Conclusion. Throughout history, reserve currencies have represented far more than units of account or media of exchange. They have embodied institutional trust. Their privilege has rested not merely upon economic output, military capability, or financial sophistication, but upon a widespread belief that reserve assets would remain dependable regardless of changing political circumstances. This exposition has proposed a simple definition. In reserve management, trust means confidence that an asset will remain liquid, accessible, legally protected, and politically usable across a wide range of future conditions. From this definition emerges a practical analytical framework, the Reserve Asset Trust Test, through which reserve assets may be evaluated consistently across time and across monetary systems. It also gives rise to a broader theoretical proposition. Reserve currencies possess a trust threshold. Geopolitical power initially reinforces trust by reducing uncertainty, strengthening institutions, and providing security. Beyond a certain point, however, increasing reliance upon coercive power may alter how reserve holders perceive the system itself. The reserve asset gradually shifts from being viewed as politically neutral infrastructure toward becoming a source of potential counterparty risk. History offers evidence that this pattern has appeared before. The Dutch guilder and British pound sterling did not suddenly cease functioning. Rather, confidence in the institutional foundations supporting those currencies gradually weakened before reserve status itself diminished. Diversification preceded displacement. The contemporary international monetary system invites the same analytical question. The United States continues to issue the world's dominant reserve currency. The dollar remains central to international finance. Its capital markets remain unmatched in depth and liquidity. None of these observations are inconsistent with the trust threshold framework. Indeed, history suggests that reserve transitions occur precisely because dominant systems continue functioning long after behavioral incentives begin changing. Whether the United States has already crossed its own trust threshold remains an open empirical question. Reasonable observers may reach different conclusions. That question should ultimately be answered through evidence rather than assertion. What can already be observed, however, is a growing emphasis on reserve diversification, sustained central bank gold accumulation, expanding interest in alternative payment architectures, and increasing discussion of strategic financial resilience. These developments do not, in isolation, prove that a threshold has been crossed. They do suggest that the conditions under which reserve trust is evaluated may be evolving. Ultimately, the future of any reserve currency depends not only upon its economic strength, but upon the continued willingness of sovereign reserve managers to entrust it with their national wealth. History suggests that this willingness cannot be commanded indefinitely through power alone. It must continue to be earned through trust. The limits of monetary power, therefore, may not be determined by the size of an economy, the strength of its military, or even the depth of its financial markets. They may ultimately be determined by something both less tangible and more enduring. Whether the world continues to believe that its reserves will remain liquid, accessible, legally protected, and politically usable, regardless of what the future may bring.